Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business innovation and managing life. Let's see. I got all kinds of questions here. And I got a few topics I thought you guys might be interested in. It's a question here from Lally. Do you have any fun Halloween plans or any memorable costumes you've dressed up in or seen? I'm not much of a costume user kind of person. I think maybe I tend to have very minimal and mundane kind of clothing choices. Somehow I find there's a certain I've sort of tried to optimize things so that I can kind of wear the same stuff wherever I'm going, whatever I'm doing. And you know, like I put on a suit probably once every 2 years or something, and mostly I'm kind of wearing the same stuff. So I think I'm not, and I haven't. I don't remember any time when I've done some kind of heavily costumed thing. My children are now too old to be interested in the trick-or-treating thing, and I'm not really part of that picture. So no, I'm no great ideas, no great suggestions for that. Around where I live in Concord, Massachusetts, I think there's some elaborate and high-end trick-or-treating costuming stuff that used to go on. I don't know what happens quite now and in these post-pandemic days, so I'm not sure about that. Let's see. Oh my. People are asking funky questions here. Matt is asking, if you could spend the day as an animal, as any animal in the world, what would it be? What might the change in perspective allow you to understand and apply towards your current work? You know, this is the point. What does it mean to, you know, we exist at our moment in time, at our place, sort of in our physical instantiation. And if you say, I'd like to go back to being, you know, 10 years old again, it's like, well, what does that mean to go back to being 10 years old? Does that mean with all your current memories and all your current sort of skills and so on, you're back in an environment where you happen to be in, you know, a 10-year-old body or something? Well, what does it really mean? And when you say be an animal, what does that mean? Because my sort of way of thinking about the world is, you know, hopefully fairly fine and dandy for me as a human existing in this part of the world and so on. If you turn me into a dolphin and, you know, with only my human sensibilities, I would quickly drown, I'm sure, because it's like, you know, I don't know how to flip around, and I don't know those kinds of things. I wouldn't even know how to, you know, if you say take me as me with my mind, so to speak, I'm not programmed to flip my tail in the right way and so on to be a dolphin. Now, similarly, the sensory information that I would have about, you know, I'm moving through the water and I can sense, you know, water pressure on, you know, fin number 3 or something. You know, that's not the mapping that my brain has to my mind. It's like, well, I know what it means to, you know, press my index finger against something, but a dolphin doesn't have an index finger. So how do you make that mapping? So I think it's very challenging to see what, you know, how do you convert a mind as it exists in oneself as a human and so on, and map that into what you might experience as another kind of critter. It'd be fascinating in the sense that I think the kind of the worldview of kind of different critters is no doubt very different from our worldview, partly because of different sensory apparatus, different physical characteristics and so on. And to be able to sort of get inside that alien mind would be totally fascinating. The problem is, it's not obvious that you can fit your mind into that alien mind. And in a sense, at some level, it's a question of, you can think about it at a minimal level, a question of communication. I mean, it's hard enough communicating from one human mind to another, let alone a human mind to an animal mind and so on. And so challenging thing, and sort of a difficult philosophical kind of setting. I mean, it's kind of like the question, a different kind of question. Imagine, cryonics works and you get to wake up 300 years from now. Does that really work? How does that work? How do you, with your kind of constructed mind as it is today from living in the 21st century, how does that map into what things look like, 200 years later? Or similarly, I mean, there's a partial simulation of that, just going from, if I tried to go, live in the Amazon jungle or something, I'm sure I wouldn't do very well, because I don't know about all the different kinds of snakes that might bite me, or the kinds of, this is a kind of beetle you can eat. This is a kind of thing where it's whatever, it's a different experience of things that it's not easy to translate into. I think it's sometimes it's always interesting when one is in situations which are sort of a bit alien like that, and there are different approaches one can take. One is, I'm just going to be me, and this alien world that I'm in, let me try and survive as best I can in it. It's a little bit like you go to country X and you don't speak the language, and you just speak English, and you just sort of let things happen as they happen, or in sometimes, like I happen to have learned French for years in school, and I can read it more or less fluently, but I never sort of developed the nerve to be able to speak it. And so it's always strange to be in a French-speaking place where you can more or less understand what people say, but are you actually going to sort of jump in and make, and kind of try and live in the quotes alien environment of speaking French and so on, or are you going to just try and speak English and maybe be able to absorb a few things and read some road signs or whatever else? And I think that the same thing happens if you're if I get plopped into an event, a party, whatever it is, with a bunch of people from some industry, domain, whatever, about which I know very little. What do you do in that situation? It's always quite interesting, because it's kind of like, can you successfully communicate? Is it the case that do you have anything to talk about? And I have to say, in different settings, I consider it an interesting challenge to find that kind of bridge that does allow one to talk about something. Because my point of view is, you can always learn things from people, and it's always interesting. And it's you run into somebody in some situation, can you actually have a conversation? And sometimes it's a bit of a challenge to find that bridge of, you find it, kids are always an interesting challenge in that regard, because it's kind of like, my view of the world might be rather different from some kids' view of the world. What can one, how can one make that bridge? Well, there are things you can ask about, hey, what social media do you use these days? And then they'll start talking about that and so on. Or you can, in times past, it always used to be a pretty good bet that you could talk about sort of popular movies with people, and a decent fraction of people would have sort of seen the same movies. That doesn't work anymore, I don't think. It's somehow things have become a bit more, well, that industry is not at its, in terms of sort of movies people go and see in movie theaters. And when it comes to things like television shows, I don't watch those myself, so I have nothing, can't talk about those things. But it's sort of an interesting challenge, is you kind of imagine you're plopped into, the Hollywood party, or the kind of the collection of construction workers, or the whatever else. It's like, can you have a reasonable conversation? I always like to take the challenge on of, yes, try and have a reasonable conversation. And I've learned all kinds of fascinating things from people. Sometimes you're sort of surprised, because I tend to kind of go for content. I remember many years ago being at some local business person event, and a bunch of people, I don't know what people really necessarily talk about there. Maybe they talk about golf, not something I can talk much about. Maybe they talk about trips they've taken, things like that. But I was talking to a person who ran a meatpacking company. And, it's my first question was, so what temperature do you have to store the meat at? And this person was like very surprised because that wasn't that type of content conversation was not one that was used to having. And then we had a fascinating conversation. And I think everybody, both sides had fun kind of talking about, me asking kind of dumb, obvious questions about what was involved in the meatpacking business, and maybe it even gave him some ideas for things that weren't things that one normally thought about, and so on. But I found that is an interesting, it's always an interesting thing to, can you have a contentful conversation with somebody, and it helps if you know a bunch of stuff about the world in general. I think I like to believe that I can learn interesting things from anybody, and sometimes those things are as much about the way a person in a certain industry or a certain background thinks about things as it is actual sort of factual content and so on. And I personally, I find those things really interesting. Let's see. Question here from Paolo. What are your thoughts on providing feedback to employees? What methodologies and tools do you use? How can we best help an employee to grow before letting them go for underperformance? Yeah, well, okay. You have to be good managers do provide feedback. Whether they provide feedback in an explicit, I'm going to sit you down and give you feedback type setting, or whether they provide feedback on a more ongoing basis, it's somewhat personality dependent. I think one thing that's important is to let people know what you think of what they've done. And, maybe I personally do a very much say it as I think of it, or say it as I think it is type approach, which means if I think something is bad, I say it's bad. And if I think something is good, I say, hey, that's good. And I think that's very helpful to people because, yeah, they get kind of upset if you say it's bad. But I think, and again, it's somewhat, it's always a thing where people who work with me, maybe they get used to or put up with or even like the way that I choose to manage things. People who work with other people, may have a different set of preferences. But for me, I like to, people may not be happy if you say that thing is really terrible. I think that but I think it's important to be able to let people know with reality that what they're hearing from you is what you actually think, and that it isn't all sugar-coated or all, positioned and postured in a certain way. It's actually what you think. Now, in terms of giving negative feedback, I have a pretty simple principle about that, which is I can say, that's a terrible thing. I won't say, I think you're an idiot. And those are very different kinds of things. In other words, you can make negative comments about the work, and if you think it's bad, you should make negative comments about the work, but there's no reason to make a kind of, I don't think, I think you're a loser type thing. Just, it isn't a useful thing to do. And I think it's not a sort of personally appropriate thing to do. At least that's my way of following these things. Now, sometimes there'll be a situation where you can see this person is doing the wrong project or is in the wrong job. And it's, you can absolutely say that without saying, hey, I think you're a total loser. You're like, look, I think you need a role that gives you more immediate feedback, or you need a more structured role, or you need a role where, this or that is the case, where you're not being forced to think about such technical things, or where you're dealing more with people or less with people or whatever else. These are things that I think are very useful to people. And sometimes it's much easier to see from the outside what somebody should be doing than it is for them from the inside to kind of work that out. And sometimes people have a lot of inertia in terms of making changes. And if somebody says to them, look, this is really not the right place for you, you should be, is there something, let's brainstorm about what you should be doing. And sometimes, and it's happened to me, sometimes the end result of that brainstorming is, look, I'm sorry, in our company right now, there isn't a place where where the peg that you are fits into the hole that we have, so to speak. And so, I've given people the advice before it's a question of, hey, that's useless, we have to let you go type thing. Given the advice, hey, maybe you should be doing this or that instead. And sometimes, sometimes in the end, you have to push, but it is something where I think it is very, very, sometimes you can see this isn't a fit, but you can see what the fit might actually be. And I think that's a useful piece of feedback to give. Now, by the time, the question is, I forget, there's a modern name for performance improvement plans. I forget what it is, but by the time the HR department is providing an improvement plan for somebody, I always think this is over. I'm sometimes wrong. Sometimes things turn around. And usually that's because there was something a little bit structurally wrong. The job wasn't quite aligned correctly. The management expectations weren't right. Or in modern times, it was something like the person isn't working in an office. They're trying to work at home. They're not able to do that very well. Or something like that, something structural that can be fixed. And that's, I think, the most common reason why things turn around. I mean, occasionally, it's people get into a mode where they're just not working very hard or well, or they need a push, and that succeeds in doing it. But I'm generally not. I'm myself. I get very pessimistic when one's dipped to the point where one feels one has to provide this kind of performance improvement plan or some such other thing. The other question is, do people who have achieved certain things and then they dip down, will they recover? And I have to say, I've seen cases where people will do really well for a while and then things will go down. Why does that happen? And for a while, it might be a year, it might be 5 years, it might be 10 years, it might be even 20 years. Why do things go down? I think there are a couple of different reasons. One is the person actually gets bored of that particular job. And they internally just think, they're not as excited about sort of going to work every day type thing. They don't necessarily see internally, hey, I should make a change. They're just sort of used to the rhythm of things and they just keep going, but they keep going with less and less energy. That's a case where, the management contribution that's really, really useful is to say, hey, what about, it looks like you're, what about thinking about this? Hey, we got this new project. Would you like to be involved in this project? Sometimes you'll get some resistance to that. People will think, oh, I've been doing the same thing for 15 years and I'm doing fairly well here. And, and why would I try something new? And sometimes it's like, oh, that's a good idea. Thanks. And they get very energized very quickly on something new. That's one case. Another case is something changes in the person's life. And, they have some personal situation that's weighing on them in some way or another. And, my attitude towards that tends to be, if the person's been working great for N years and they're going through some complicated personal thing, and it's going to take, and you pretty much know it's the kind of thing that's going to take a year to work its way through or something like that. It's like, look, they worked N years really well. It's like, just, cut them some slack for some period of time. If the 1 year turns into, much longer than that or whatever it is, then you have to start worrying. But I kind of feel like there are cases where people are just going to be out of sorts because of some external personal thing. And I think one just has to say, look, this is going to happen, if one can, and if it makes sense. It's like, hey, why don't you partially go on leave or whatever else to, deal with the situation or whatever it is. That's good if you can make it happen. But even without that, I kind of think sometimes you just have to say, look, you've contributed enough for enough years. Something's gone wrong, which is temporary. Let's just let you work that out and not put a lot of pressure on you during that period of time, rather than saying, hey, look, you're not doing such a good job. Hey, what, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, just lay off for at least a temporary period of time. And I found that really has worked very well. I mean, there are plenty of examples I've seen where whatever situation it was, it works its way through. If one has been sort of as civilized as possible in letting the person take the time or whatever to work things through, that's appreciated. And then they actually solve the problem, and then they come back and they're very, very productive. So a few thoughts along those lines. Let's see. There's a comment here from Technic Beam about, I just finished reading Things a Computer Scientist Rarely Talks About by Donald Knuth. Apparently mentions the possibility of the universe being a cellular automaton. Not something I specifically have ever thought, but being computational, yes, I'm pretty sure that's true. And the question is, have I read this book? And the answer is no. And I certainly have known Don Knuth for a long, long time, and we exchange messages with some frequency, actually. I often feel a little guilty because Don is somebody who has kind of signed up in his life to do a very big project that he started in the early 1960s to write his, I think it was originally 8-volume, a book on the art of computer programming. And it's kind of a really quite remarkable life work effort. And he's only on volume 4 so far. And I think volume 4 is expanding almost without bound. And I kind of feel like, Don is significantly older than me. And I kind of feel like, any time that I take exchanging messages with him is time he's not trying to finish his life work. And I feel a little bit guilty about that. Although, it's sort of an interesting thing, this process of defining for yourself. He must have been in his 20s when he defined this kind of project that he intended to be a project of a certain size, and it's dragged on for close to 60 years now, and that's an interesting thing. This is kind of a segue onto something that I thought I would talk about a little bit. I happen to have been doing a project right now that is kind of finishing off something that I started 50 years ago. So it's a science project about the second law of thermodynamics, which is something that I got interested in when I was 12 years old. And it was the thing that caused me to write my first serious computer program when I was like 13 or so. And it's something that I've had a scientific interest in all of that time for 50 years. And I finally got to the point through this big physics project that we've done of feeling like I pretty much understand the second law of thermodynamics, which is something that has been around. The second law has been around for 150 years. It's generated large amounts of confusion. It's a whole complicated story. Let me not tell the science story here. But I set myself the task of writing 3 pieces about the second law. One is a technical piece about what I've actually figured out about the second law. The third piece is about the general history of the second law and all of the characters who've been involved and how the various confusions that have happened historically seem to have happened. But the second piece is a piece about my 50-year journey in studying the second law. And so I'm right in the middle of that right now. And it's really interesting for me because I have pretty good archives. Some of them are very well organized, some of them are less well organized. Frustratingly, a lot of what I am now writing about are things that happened in things like the early 1980s, when some amount of stuff was typed and is readily searchable, through the fact that I've OCR'd scans of documents and things, but quite a lot of it is handwritten. And that isn't yet systematically searchable for. So I've ended up going through an awful lot of archive material that I have. I mean, I personally have around 250,000 pages of scanned documents that I generated mostly before about 1984, which was when I kind of switched to being largely digital, so to speak. At least my output is largely digital. But you know, one thing I found interesting is I've been going back and trying to understand what was the kind of thread over this 50-year period of my work in this project or in this question. And there are things that I suppose I find kind of interesting in terms of timescales for things happening. Like I just discovered yesterday, between May 26th of 1984 and June 1st of 1984, I made a whole bunch of discoveries, and they happened very quickly. And I kind of understood their significance pretty quickly, and I was off and running. But there was a precursor of multiple years when some of those discoveries were hanging right in front of my nose, and I completely didn't understand them. And somehow, at that moment, I had gotten myself, and I think one big piece of it, it's a kind of a funny story, actually. I started working on these things called cellular automata, these simple programs that end up having complicated behavior, although that wasn't what I expected them to have. And I started simulating them on computers in late 1981. And, you know, my output method at the time was line printer paper, just stars and spaces printed on paper. So I could make a certain size of picture, figured out a bunch of things from that. Then a couple of years later, I got a bitmap display computer with a bitmap display, a Sun workstation computer. And suddenly I saw a bunch more stuff. And then and I can't quite get the date, I have to see that I've got the documents that would give me the precise date. I got a laser printer, and that allowed me to generate output at much higher resolution than I had before. And somehow, as sort of a test of the laser printer, I think, I printed out some images at much higher resolution, and immediately I could see a bunch of things. I mean, I'd had to have multiple years of being primed to see them, but somehow that new methodology, it's kind of the new telescope that you're able to point in some place in this case, in the computational universe and see things, that was really a critical element of what was possible there. But so one thing that I found is there are these times when things happen really quickly. And then there are times when it really doesn't look like much is happening at all. And you know, another thing I suppose has been interesting for me looking back at these archives is, you know, I have decent records of what happened sort of, you know, every meeting I did back in, you know, 1983 or something like this. And a question I've said about looking through these archives, it's kind of in some ways, it's a kind of a strange thing to say, but every story that was open in 1983 has an ending today. That is, all those people that I interacted with back in 1983, I can go look them up on the web. Maybe I'll find an obituary. That's unfortunate. Maybe I'll find a whole story about what happened with that person. But every story that was kind of opened in 1983, there's a something like an end to that story, or at least a lot of progress in that story. And I think that one question would be, of the things that I was doing back in 1983, what things were worth doing? What were not? I think there were many things where I was building towers of various kinds, towers of technology, towers of science, towers in some cases of sort of getting organizationally plugged into the world. I think when they were things that kind of built up progressively, those things feel from that distance to be pretty worthwhile, because I can say, well, I figured out that little piece of science or something, and now I've built 18 levels above that in things I've done subsequently. Then there were lots of things where I sort of, I found, you know, back in 1983, which is a bunch of the time I was just looking at, because the time when a bunch of things happened in the science I was doing, you know, I went to an awful lot. Did an awful lot of traveling. I went to an awful lot of conferences. I gave an awful lot of talks. I met with a bunch of people. I did all kinds of things. I was doing all kinds of stuff. My first company was up and running at that time. I was doing some things with it and so on. And it's, as I say, there's a lot of stuff where, you know, 40-something years later, 40-ish years later, it's like, well, I did that, but nothing really came of it. It didn't really go anywhere. And other things where sort of is a brick in building this tower, and I can see that brick was necessary, and that tower is something that I'm kind of still living in today, so to speak. So I don't know, I haven't really quite concluded my ruminations or something on what you learn from seeing this sort of arc of a 50-year project. I will say that one of the things that, make one comment, which is the value of a quotes finished project is vastly higher than the value of a project that got started and not finished. And in my life, I've tried to finish a lot of projects. This is a project where I've been kind of meaning to finish it for a long time. And I don't think I will have finished it now, but I've at least tied it in a certain kind of bow that is going to be sort of satisfactory to me. Let's talk about finishing projects for a second. Question is, what does it mean to finish a project? For example, Wolfram language, it'll never be finished. There'll never be a point where one says, there's nothing more to do with this. There are other kinds of projects where by the definition of the project, it gets finished. Like when I wrote my big book, A New Kind of Science, there was a moment at the beginning of 2002 when it was finished, because it's a book. And a book is like a thing where you're sort of like saying, it's done. Now, having said it's done, we're still working on getting all of the code and pictures in that book to be fully transportable, and so you can click them from the book and run them in your notebook or whatever else. So in that sense, it's not finished. And certainly the work that is done on the basis of that book is very, very, very far from finished. But for me personally, the idea that there's this project and something allowed me to just sort of declare victory and finish it and say, now I move on to something different. Maybe I'm doing things, talking to people about that. You know, I'm still giving talks about it. I'm still doing this and that, but the core project is finished. And I think it's very nice. You know, writing has that feature that it tends to be the case that you can just finish something. You know, the pieces that I write, I find it very satisfying to be able to say, I'm written this piece, you know, eventually these things I'm writing about the second law, they'll be finished. Now, that doesn't mean that I won't be still talking about them, doing things with them, but they'll be finished. Now, for me personally, I tend to take this point of view that I'll put a lot of intensity into doing a project. And then I'll say, this project is finished. There is sort of after finishing work that is to be done with it, but it's of a different character. And for me, it's kind of like, okay, I've finished that project. Maybe one day, N years from now, I will pick up something related again, but that will be a different project. And sometimes I'll be storing kind of sort of the follow-ons to a given project in my sort of file system. I tend to have, for anything I've written, I'll have a folder and I'll have a thing called follow-ons. And I'll put, you know, when people send me mail about, oh, what about this, what about that, or I see something that people have done on the basis of the thing, I'll stick that in the follow-ons folder. I have to say my rate of looking at those follow-ons folders is not super high on a short time scale, but on a long time scale, the follow-on from project A ends up being something where I know as I start project B that I'm going to care about the follow-ons to project A. So that's a thing that I then get to look at. But at least for me, I like the idea that I can define a project. So there is a moment when it is, for practical purposes, its core is finished, so to speak. And so when I look back at things I did in the past, most of the things I did got to that sort of it's finished point. They got to a stage where I could say it's finished and where there might be more to do, but I'm not going to immediately do that. Cases where I didn't do it, they're frustrating and they stay frustrating forever. And there are things where, you know, I find these pieces that I wrote where it's an almost finished thing. Why didn't I finish this? You know, there are cases where it's sort of a sunk cost type thing. You've done a certain amount and it just went way off track. And like, it's better to kill it than to throw more sort of resources. I would say that in, you know, I think I talked about this before, you know, understanding how to pivot a project and take what you really did achieve, because if you spend a bunch of time on it, you probably did achieve something. You just might not have achieved things which were along the lines of the particular objective that you had in mind. So for example, I found a bunch of things where I started writing things, they had one title. I realized that it went off. What I actually discovered was different from what that title said. And it ended up with a quite different title. But it ended up with a finished thing that was sort of a meaningful sort of brick in this tower that I've been building. So D0 is commenting here, maybe project is not an adequate word for undertakings like Wolfram Alpha. Yeah, you know, I have to say, perhaps it is my, I'm a person who tends to be something of an optimist. And when you're looking at a dauntingly large project, and I say project again, I think of it as a project because I do imagine that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, that there's if not a finishing, there's something. Yes, I suppose perhaps it's a reflection of kind of an optimism that I'll call these things projects because they're huge and they take large fractions of one's life, and they don't really have that same beginning, middle, end that one might think of as a project, so to speak. I think that so yeah, I don't know what the right term for that is. Life work might be a better term. Anyway, I sort of found it interesting to look at kind of the steps in what has ended up for me being a 50-year project. Now, it's a 50-year project that has languished for sometimes 5 or 10 years at a time. And it's a project where, unlike many projects, well, it's had some waypoints. I've had things I've written about it in intermediate stages, but it's well, I don't know. I think I haven't formed my thoughts properly, but I think it's just I mean, the question that I have for myself is, what can I learn about projects that I'm doing today based on looking back over a period of 40, 50 years about what was important in projects I did back then? I think another thing that I could say that was important, and it's about building these towers, building tools of various kinds, both conceptual tools and practical tools. That seems to be something that was worthwhile. And again, it's I suppose it's just because it allows you to kind of sort of progressively build things rather than just do that. Let me mention another thing. I mean, when I look back at things I did, I don't know, late 1970s, I was working on physics and I wrote papers and things like that. I should say a strategy that I've adopted forever is I try to, when I do something, a project, so to speak, I try and get it to the point where it is definitive within the boundaries that I've set for it. So, you know, when I wrote academic papers back in the day, I always used to try to say, I'm going to pick this domain, I'm going to pick this question, and I'm going to just drill out basically everything obvious around this question. I'm not picking a bigger question, I'm picking this particular question. Sometimes the question weren't so small, but my goal was drill it all out, because I'm not going to write another paper about the same thing. This is going to be my my contribution to this thing. I personally have found that a very satisfying way to work. Other people have sometimes, if they're doing research or something like this, will say, I'm going to do the same, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do the increment of this and the increment of this and so on. I found that times when I've ended up doing that for one reason or another, I found that very unsatisfying. For me, it's much better to take this thing, wrap my arms around it, drill as deep as possible, sort of finish the package and put it out there, and then move on and do the next thing. I mean, I suppose that's a funny thing for me to be saying, because I built these kind of life work towers as well. But I would say that I like to be able to think that there are pieces where it's like you do that piece and you can say it's finished and then you move on, rather than you do a piece, you leave it kind of a little bit unfinished and you're going to have to go fix it later, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That I personally find that very difficult, and so tend to avoid that. Well, let's see. Gosh, there are the questions here which are pretty sciencey, and maybe this is not my moment to talk about those. Well, RBS is asking, do you have a time frame for a physics project, or is it a lifelong project? If you had to work on another idea project, what would that be? Our physics project, by its own definition, is an infinite project. The project has to do with understanding everything about how the universe works, so to speak. And that's sort of, by definition, an infinite project. It has waypoints. The question of how difficult those waypoints are to reach is a question that's hard to answer. I kind of, in many cases, know the direction to go, but I don't necessarily know how difficult it is to get there. I think the physics project is something that, yes, it's a project that I expect to continue, I hope. And with the Wolfram Institute that we just launched 2 days ago, we've got another venue for pursuing the physics project. It's something where I hope, it will be continued. I hope that I'm not, there are many other people involved in it right now, but from some point of view, there are things where I'm the CEO. I would love it if I was not the CEO of our physics project, so to speak. And if it developed enough kind of strength in its own right that that intellectual direction can continue without sort of my immediate leadership, so to speak. In terms of other projects, my gosh, I mean, you can go look at the wolframinstitute.org website and you'll see a few that are sort of science-based. But what's happened from the physics project is we've kind of developed this paradigm, this multi-computation paradigm. Let me not talk about all its technical details here. But that paradigm it's like, given this paradigm, I just made a new kind of telescope. Different analogy, I'm in a candy store and there are all these fields and I can like pick up different ones and do something interesting with them. And so it's really a moment of, for me, it's just really exciting, because we did a big thing on metamathematics where I think we made a lot of progress in understanding what mathematics is and kind of the fundamental laws of mathematics and so on, and how they are analogous to physics and so on. That's an example of an area. There's a whole bunch of stuff in distributed computing that is just tremendous. I mean, it's really I think it's quite transformational stuff that in a sense happens because of a certain amount of the fact there's a common formalism bridging to physics and so on. There's a bunch of stuff in molecular biology that I've been thinking about, and molecular computing. There's some things in economics, there's things in linguistics, there might be things in machine learning, in neuroscience. It's really great, it's really exciting. The thing for me with some of those kinds of projects, the way that I tend to work is I sort of forage information for a long time. gradually learning about, whatever it is, neuroscience, molecular biology, economics, whatever, forage for a long time, try to get myself some kind of sort of ambient understanding of what's going on. And then there'll be a moment where I dive in with intensity to one of those things. And sometimes for some of those things I've sort of been interested, like molecular computing, I've been interested for a long time, but I've always felt I don't really know quite how to get into this. I'm not sure that the ambient technology in the world and so on has reached the point where if I dive in, can I really make progress, or will I just be blocked because it'll be like, oh, I don't know how to do those kinds of chemical experiments or something like this, and I need to do that to make progress, and it's kind of like, this is the wrong decade to do that. But just right now, it's kind of a great thing that we have this new paradigm and all these different areas that I've thought about and been gradually accumulating knowledge about. It looks like we can really make progress, but in each one of them, I have to like dive in and really do it. Now, one dynamic that for me at least is that, working with other people, this is something which is true of the company. I think it will be true of our institute as well. It's like, I will inject certain ideas, then there's a bunch of work to be done and new ideas to be had that needs other people. It's very helpful to have other people to carry it forward. If it was just me, it would be like, well, I got to do this project, then I've got to do this project, and so on, and there'd be nothing happening. It's like an operating system scheduling jobs or something where, in a time when there's only one thing running at a time, so to speak. I'm only doing it sort of single tasking type thing. I just, for me, it's much better to do one project for a while, then do the next project, and so on. The only way I avoid that is by working with other people and having the multitasking thing be like, okay, I'm going to do this meeting once a week about this thing, and the rest of the time, other people are going to be moving this forward. And at some moment, it might get very intense, and I might be spending a lot of my time specifically as an individual on that project. So one of the challenges is that one accumulates a lot of stuff one does. I built products, companies, projects, whatever, and there is a great tendency to just say there's overwhelmingly much maintenance to do on the things I've already built, incremental work to be done on the things I've already built. How can I ever possibly do anything new? I think one of my sort of personal pieces of, I don't know, tenacity or something is, or maybe it's just a sort of attention deficit or something, is that I do new things, and I make a big effort to do new things. And I suppose maybe it's because I like new things maybe better than I like the incremental development of old things. And so I'm always saying, any given moment, there's no way I have time to do something new. If you just added up all the different commitments and things I do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, if you just did that accounting, you would say there's no way I could ever do anything new. Yet I'm always doing new things. And somehow just the force of, look, I'm going to do a new thing, and I'm going to make this work somehow. I'm going to spend this time doing this new thing. I don't know exactly what it's going to push out, and I don't really think that hard about that. I don't say, oh, to do this new thing, I have to stop doing this thing and this thing and this thing. It's just like, I do this new thing. The way it feels internally, I don't know if this is actually supported by the data, the way it feels internally is I'm so excited about the new thing that I'm basically working more efficiently and creating time for myself because I'm so excited about that new thing. If I was doing the older things, things would be going slower. I would be sort of, time dilated or something. And it's so the opposite. And kind of things would be running, just all sort of be running more slowly. But as soon as I have something new that I'm really excited about, it's like that just makes, creates more time, so to speak. I mean, I'm a person who pretty much, works all the time I can, and I don't have kind of the, let me sort of recreate in or just, chillax or whatever. It's not my way. And so I don't really have the opportunity to say, oh, let me watch less television or something, and I'll use that time to do this or that. I'm already maxed out in terms of that allocation of time. But somehow the enthusiasm to do a new thing always manages to just sort of, push a little bit away the older things, and the new thing fits in. But it's a thing that I suppose is very important to me, because I really like doing new things, that I'm able to do that. Another thing for me is when I'm doing something that I can really say, clean break, I'm going to start doing this. That is very useful to me to do that. When it's kind of like the moment when I'm starting something is an exciting moment. Like, let's say I start working on economics. I've been doing foraging for a while. I've been doing a little bit of thinking and learning stuff, talking to people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, it's good that I haven't really done that much on it, because it will feel much fresher when I actually say, okay, today I'm going to start working on this, when maybe some people are going to be working with me, and so on. Anyway, just these are asking, how do you tackle a problem? Do you dive into it, or first observe the bigger picture? For me, there's a lot of sort of drill down to the foundations that I like to do. People say, oh, how do you solve this problem? And usually the thing they state isn't the real problem to solve. There is a deeper, often intellectually more complex, intellectually richer, intellectually more interesting thing that is the foundational thing to solve. Because usually when people have gotten to something and it's rattling around and they haven't been able to solve it and so on, there's a reason they haven't been able to solve it. It's not lack of technical ability, usually. It's usually there's tooling that's missing, there's ideas that's missing, there's something more foundational that's missing. So it's a really good strategy to just go and sort of drill down. Let's go figure out the bedrock that this thing is sitting on, because often even by the process of doing that, you somehow miraculously sometimes evaporate the problem, so to speak, because it was like, well, people were chasing that particular thing, but it was the wrong thing to chase. So I think that's, for me, the important thing is drill down, make sure you really understand it. So another thing that can happen is somebody says, well, this is a problem. And you think about it and you realize, I don't really understand this problem. Actually, you might go a fair distance. You might do a bunch of technical work. And then you might realize, oh my gosh, I didn't understand. I should have asked these questions. I should have asked these foundational questions. That's goofy. I mean, the same thing happens even in business kinds of things, where it's like, oh, we're talking about this project, this deal, this whatever else. And you're sort of things are floating around and things are happening and so on. You realize, hey, wait a minute, let me ask the very basic question. How does this thing make money, or whatever the issue is? And it's like, oh, we didn't think about that. And so for me, my number one approach is drill down to get to the foundations. Now, that can be intellectually hard, and it can involve a bunch of knowledge. You have to ask a bunch of people, you have to ingest a bunch of knowledge. For me, knowing I've got this problem, I'm going to drill to its foundations, and I'm going to learn everything I need to go and build up from those foundations back up to this problem. That defines a certain set of things that I should learn, and then I go out and learn them. And sometimes by talking to people, sometimes by reading things, sometimes by doing sort of toy problems to understand what's going on, those kinds of things. I mean, in terms of the this question asked whether dive into the problem or look at the bigger picture. Get to the foundations. That usually involves a bigger picture. At the foundations, there's lots of other stuff you can see, so to speak. So I think it's very rare, at least in my experience, that the narrowly defined problem, it's like debugging a program. Somebody says, I'm sure there's something wrong here, or I'm sure what's going wrong is this. And I've been looking for it for 2 weeks. Well, almost always, the answer is you were looking in the wrong place. Almost always, it's you got to be, broader, deeper. What was really going on? Did the understand more of the foundations. So Joseph asks here, when studying something new, do you understand the historical development of concepts, reading from textbooks, working out examples? So I never work out examples from textbooks. I'm just not psychologically suited to that. I'm like, if I'm doing this thing from a textbook, a million other people have done it before. I don't really care. I know it's doable. The information I get from the fact that it's an exercise in a textbook is that it can be done. And that's, great. It can be done. Good. If I need to do something like that, then I'll worry about doing it. Otherwise, I'm good, so to speak. For me, I always, the way I tend to work is I'm going to define a question and work on that question. And then I'm going to do the things it takes and learn the things it takes to be able to answer that question in a way that's driven by sort of my curiosity and so on, rather than, oh, you just should learn these things. I mean, I have to say I'm pretty terrible at that, I think. Although looking back at my archives and looking at things I did when I was a kid, I would say that the things I did that I just did for my own sake, like writing all kinds of long things about physics and so on, that was a very different track from the things I did because I was doing them in school. I was actually better than I remembered being at doing the things in school. But the things, a different track. But for me, it's like define a potentially toy problem, define a thing where I wonder how this works. For me, also, obviously, using computational language is critical to being able to do things. And one thing that's sort of, I suppose, an unfair advantage, except it's not really an advantage because everybody has access to it, is that this idea of computational language and ability to use computational language, that's a new thing. That's a 21st century thing, more or less. It's something where you can take that methodology, those tools, and you can apply them to everything. And chances are, whatever has been done before hadn't had those tools applied. So you get kind of a free ride of being able to figure things out, make things clearer, state them in computational terms, all those kinds of things that people didn't have the opportunity to do before. Now, in terms of historical development of things and understanding that, I find that super useful because I'll get some concepts, I'll understand those concepts, I'll explore things with those concepts. And sometimes I'll get to the question, why didn't people do this? Why do people assume it's this way? And it's like, is there a good reason for this? The only way, in my experience, to really find out is go look at the history and go say, why did they do it this way? Why is that what everybody believes? And maybe you'll get back to, okay, there's a good reason for this. I get it. And sometimes it's like, wait a minute. People just got completely confused 150 years ago and went off in the wrong direction, and nobody ever bothered to look back at that and realize it was the wrong direction. Another thing about historical development, I sometimes wonder, when it comes to an area like math, you're teaching math to kids, and the kids are like, I don't understand this. I don't understand how this works. This is very confusing. They get stuck on things. I sometimes feel it might be useful to tell them, well, actually, people got stuck on that question for 500 years. And it turns out we now know how it works. And the fact that you're getting stuck now, it's like, don't feel bad because everybody got stuck on it for 500 years and finally figured it out. And I think it would be useful, and people don't do this, but I think it would sometimes be useful to understand, there are fields like philosophy, for example, where people do go and read what was written in antiquity. But there are other fields, the STEM kinds of fields, where people are usually just, this is what we know now. Now, it is true that learning all the mistakes that were made in the past is actually pretty confusing sometimes. But once you more or less understand how things work now, this or if you're having, if you're trying to understand, if you're sort of, I don't know quite how to formulate this, but if you're sort of confused about something, it might be useful to know, or at least for the teacher to know, sort of how was this, what was the story by which this was figured out originally. And maybe people had, the most distinguished math person back in the 1500s had exactly the same confusion as the 12-year-old is having now. And, and it got resolved. Perhaps it just got resolved by people saying, well, okay, now we're comfortable with complex numbers or something like this, rather than something else. Or I don't know, one that I know is a sticking point sometimes is the notion of a function, which I think has been much clarified by our whole computational language story, but that's a different matter. But that's something where, that's confusing to the student, so to speak. It's also confusing. It was confusing for a solid 100 years or something to the professionals. And anyway, for me, it's very useful to go back at the right moment. It's very useful to go back and look at the history, particularly if you're confused about something, going back and seeing why did people come to believe that? Because sometimes it's kind of horrifying. It's just been happening to me with the history I've been looking at about thermodynamics. Sometimes you go back in the history and you say, oh my gosh, people really were confused. They actually took the wrong track. And now, and I say, how can I possibly be right when these people have been wrong when I now think these people have been wrong for such a long period of time? But you go back and look at the history and you realize, well, by golly, there were two roads and they took the wrong one. And you can kind of see how that happened. And then you feel more confident about the fact that, well, I think now we've got the right road and it's this one here. Paul asks the interesting question, have to wonder how Bertrand Russell would have viewed our Metamathematics project. I don't know. I'm not as impressed with Bertrand Russell as some people perhaps are. I think he got a lot of free ride from being a good writer. I think that his projects in metamathematics were important in terms of sort of making a point, but kind of crazy in terms of the actual mechanics of what was done. I think making the point that, well, you can in principle build up mathematics from very low-level foundations. I don't think that, I think, what would he say about our project? I think, it's an interesting question. I think I'm sure he would have some very British witticism about it. I think, again, it's one of these questions like somebody was asking about, if you can be an animal for a day, it's kind of like, well, Bertrand Russell died around probably late 60s, early 70s. And, it's kind of like if he had lived until now, he lived to a very ripe old age, but if he had lived until now and was sort of subject to the ambient kind of culture that we have today, so to speak, and the science that is sort of ambient today, and computing and computation and ideas about computation that are ambient today, the reaction will be very different than going back in the time machine to the, let's say, how old was Russell in 1910 when he wrote Principia Mathematica? He must have been, I would guess, in his 20s or 30s, early 30s, 20s perhaps. If you go back to the Bertrand Russell in his 20s in the 1910s, what we have to say about the Metamathematics Project and its computational foundations would just be totally alien. It would just be, this is an alien invasion from sometime in the 21st century, and nobody can understand what's going on. And I'm afraid that sometimes I feel like some of the work that I do is of that character. It's like, it comes from 100 years in the future and it's hard to understand today. It's kind of satisfying and personally sort of fun and interesting. It's kind of like, really live in the 22nd century type thing by thinking about things which will be common at that time. It's fun and interesting, although it can sometimes be somewhat frustrating to be actually in the 21st century with the ambient knowledge that exists at that time. All right, I think we should. I need to wrap up in a moment here, but actually, maybe I have another couple of minutes here. Parker asks about what's been the response reaching out to academics about our physics project. Actually, it's been really good. Sometimes when you introduce some new set of ideas in a well-developed field, there's a kind of an immune response and everybody's like horrified. But I think because our physics project really plugs into a lot of existing mathematical physics ideas, there's clear points of contact and there's clear value in sort of making that connection. And I would say that the challenge for academics is academia, it's a profession, and people have a certain rhythm of what they do, and they develop to a certain point and they're doing field X with subfield Y, subfield Z, and they have students who are working on subfield Z, and they have grants that are coming in about subfield Z, and they go to those conferences and they know the social group that's around subfield Z. And when you say, hey, here's this really new thing, for well-developed academics in a well-developed field, so to speak, it's not the switching time, the switching cost is pretty high. It's like I was talking about with employees. Sometimes people do get, they've been working on, I've been working in the same field for 35 years and I'm kind of bored. We've seen that a bunch of times, both with the technology side and the science side, that there are people who have had very good careers in some particular thing. They've reached a point where they realize, hey, I'd like to do something new. And that's terrific because they've got a foundation of knowledge, experience, a position in the world. They're able to sort of start doing something new and take in these new ideas. And we're seeing a certain amount of that with the physics project, but that is a much more expensive thing. The switching cost is pretty high. As a mid-career academic or something, the switching cost is high. For younger people who are less committed, the switching cost is much lower. And that's where we're seeing much more kind of academic entanglement on an immediate basis. But I would say the nice thing about the physics project is that the sort of senior academics, even if they're not jumping in and doing it themselves, are kind of like, yeah, this is an interesting thing. Well, maybe one of my students will be interested in this kind of thing. So I would say it's been a pretty successful thing. And I think that the kind of idea that sort of the kind of, it's alien, let's bring out our pitchforks, really hasn't been happening at all. It's funny because 20 years ago, when I talked a little bit about pieces of this in connection with new kind of science, there were physicists who definitely brought out their pitchforks. I have to say something that is one of these, it's a funny thing because maybe 30 years ago, the web didn't exist. And maybe a little bit more than that, but in the 80s, the web didn't exist. And the thing that, and there were all kinds of interactions I would have with people. And I think now, looking back in my archives, looking on the web to see what actually happened, it actually makes more sense why some pitchforks showed up that I didn't understand why they showed up. And I realize it because I'm finding that, people thought they were working on the same thing and they were upset that I didn't know about what they worked on. Well, I didn't know about what they worked on because I didn't know about it. Because I didn't, because the web didn't exist and you couldn't go look it up. Or in some cases, there were people who kind of might have gotten their backs up about something, but yet I discover decades after the fact, actually there was a terrific bridge that could have been made. I just didn't know it was there. I just didn't know that the sort of two ends, I didn't know that the connection that could have been made because I didn't know some fact about that person or their history or whatever else. So, maybe part of the reason is content-wise, that our physics project plugs in so nicely to all these areas of mathematical physics. Part of it is the state of physics and the fact that it doesn't feel like, oh, we've solved the problem of how everything works already. We don't need anything else. Part of it has to do with kind of the dynamics of the world and how one can find out things and how people learn things and so on, and the kind of way that we're doing the sort of open science approach, things like this. So I think a lot of things have changed there, but I would say that it's really a good story, and I think we'll see more of this as the Institute develops and as we interact with more people through the Institute. But I mean, one might hope that, a new idea, you drop a new idea in a field and suddenly the whole field turns green or something, suddenly the whole thing kind of, it just takes over the whole field. It doesn't happen that way. It never happens that way. In terms of history, decades after the fact, it often looks like, you just put that drop in there and suddenly everything changed. But on the ground, it essentially never happens that way. Sometimes there is a little bit of rapid expansion, but usually even that is not correct. I mean, what you see is there's apparent rapid expansion because there's all kinds of news about, did you know about that deep learning idea? And there's a sort of there's a magnifying effect of, because there's news about it, it kind of seems like there's more activity. But when you look at what's actually going on, it may be quite small and it grows only fairly gradually. And I think one sees that. I've seen that with a bunch of things I've done. Sometimes there's news, it seems like, it just took over everything. It's cool. You see that, but it's actually a small thing that's just gradually growing, and it's going to take 5, 10, whatever years to grow. Now, of course, the paradox of these things is those 5 or 10 years of growth, when things are still sort of not super big and dominating lots of things, those are the rapid growth years. Those are the years when people who get involved get sort of pulled up by that growth and get to be part of sort of building the foundations of the thing. After that 10-year period, people come in and now it's a thing. And yes, you can make a profession out of it, but the most rapid growth is probably over. So it's kind of like it's a risk, it's a sort of a risk reward type thing, because it's like, well, you jump into this thing that's still kind of embryonic and it's in rapid growth. There's a risk that growth may not pan out, that it may be like, we hit a wall, the whole thing crashes. But if it pans out, then then you've been part of that key part of growth, and you've contributed sort of much bigger bricks than you'll be able to contribute as you build the thing in the future. Now, this of course requires that to do this well, you have to have reasonable taste about what are the things that are the things to get involved in. And I think one heuristic that's really quite simple is this area an area that you personally resonate with? Is it an approach? Is it a methodology that personally makes sense to you? Or is it something where you can say, look, I can, there's gold that's been found here. Let me go, pan for gold in this river, even though it's a very unpleasant environment for me. And even though it's very unnatural for me to do this, there's gold that's been found. So let me go and chase that. I think that if you are in something where it really fits, this moment, it's something that really resonates with you. It's something where you say, I really like doing computer experiments. I really like doing whatever it is. And I just have, I have a fun time when I'm doing this. Then I think that even if the promise of the field didn't necessarily go the way that the super growth, might be expected to go, you will get a lot out of being involved, and you will probably find a way to take that thing, which is sort of a fundamental thing that you like, and turn it into something that makes sense. Whereas if you were just sort of wheeled in sort of as a, oh gosh, I can kind of hold my nose and pan, and pan for gold because there's gold to be found here, I don't think that ends nearly as well. I don't think it's something. I think if it turns out there wasn't any gold there, then you just have lost that time and you've not sort of enriched yourself in doing it. I have to say, I have noticed something about myself that is, I don't know, I have this terrible habit of whistling when I work, and fortunate that I'm away from everybody else. So, the thing I've noticed in recent times is there's certain projects and certain things I'm doing where I just sort of don't really notice it, but I kind of spontaneously start whistling when I sit down to work on those things. And there's a certain argument that that's my audio indication of this is something I should be doing. This is something I like to do. And I think that's, I don't know, probably for other people, there might be something less crazy and disruptive than, the whistling while you work. But the question is, can you tell which things you really like doing and which things you just feel you have to do or whatever? It's a useful thing to learn that. Anyway, time for me to wrap up here, and I got to go back to my day job here. And I think we're doing a live stream actually in just a moment as part of the day job software design review. So thanks for asking lots of interesting questions, got me to think about lots of kinds of things. And I look forward to doing this another time. Bye for now.